Now, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Guringai people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our university now stands. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for these unceded places. I'm also speaking to you from my home on Gadigal land, and Chris will be speaking to you from Melbourne, and we respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land there, the Kulin Nations. So before we begin, please feel free to ask a question at any time in the chat function. And because this is a webinar format, I'll look through these and address them for you to Chris. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Christopher Raja. So Chris, in addition to being Melbourne-based, has spent a lot of time living and working in Alice Springs. He's the author of a young adult novel, Burning Elephant, and a memoir, Into the Suburbs, A Migrant Story. His co-authored play with Natasha Raja, The First Garden, has been performed in botanical gardens throughout Australia. During his 2021 New Writers Residence here with UTS in the Department of Creative Writing, Christopher has been working on his third book, a novel that was to be written from the point of view of a Southeast Asian camel driver working in the Australian outback in the late 1800s, but one in which he's learned, as he will tell us in his talk that follows, which will be about 20 minutes, he's learned to speak camel. So I'm going to pass you over to Chris. Chris, please take it away.
Thank you, Delia. And yes, I'd like to acknowledge the Kulin Nations where I'm talking from, and I'll just get straight into it. So speak camel. This is my quest for literary fiction. My novel in progress happens to be set in 19th century Australia and is about the experiences of an Afghan cameleer, Kadir, and his 6 camels, Kaswa, Adbar, Abu Jal, Batul, Laila, and Benazir. But I want to escape or transcend the sometimes fetishistic period detail of historical novels such as Clothing, Whips, and Steamships, and focus on the temperament and inner life of my characters, including the camels. The italicized material below is drawn from notes I had made for my novel to make each of my camels unique. Kaswa had a rich chocolate brown coat. He was larger and heavier than the other camels. The big boy had a soft palate which hung out the side of the mouth when inflated, producing a large, bright pink sac that he used in the hope of attracting the females. Male camels are polygamous, and Kaswa was no different. He would mate with numerous females. Kaswa was not easily spooked or flighty. At 12 years of age, he was in his prime, had great endurance, was fast in long runs, could carry cargo, and handle terrible conditions. He could live up to 40 years. When measuring Kaswa, Kadir's father, Ishmael, taught his son not to measure the height of the hump, as that may vary with the amount of food and activity and had undertaken. Ishmael had castrated Kaswa when he was no longer needed for breeding, as this eliminated aggressive behavior. Adbar was a supreme strong, fearless, yet also trusting and delicate, so that she responded well to gentleness. She was much leaner than Kaswa, had a light brown coat, and was 11 years old. Mother of Abu Jal, Adbar was just a very happy camel, good-natured, very relaxed. Occasionally, she would be bullied by the domineering Kaswa, but they had a deep bond, and even that mighty mule showed her deference and would not get in the way of her and their calf, Abu Jal. Abu Jal, the calf, enjoyed caresses on his smooth, honey-colored cheeks. He was a social animal and easy to train. Camels are very social animals. Son of Kaswa and Adbar, Abu Jahl had all the characteristics of a lead camel, even though he was born on the ship. A typical herd of camels was led by one dominant male. At approximately 2 months old, Abu Jahl began to graze on grass and would be weaned at 4 months. After the age of 1, a male calf should be moved on from the herd. His father would tolerate his being part of the caravan until then. Batul was a reddish-brown camel. She was very curious, keen to come over and investigate anything new and interesting. Batul liked to sniff everyone and everything. She was Adbar's sister. At 3 years of age, she loved to eat grasses on the ground. But best of all, she loved to follow Kaswa and attempt to reach up into bushes and trees for leaves. Kadir found food was a beneficial tool, and Batul would willingly follow him for a bit of her favorite hay or fruit. She moaned and groaned when she didn't get her way, and Layla was quick to try and comfort her. Layla looked like an older version of Batul. She was 16, demonstrative, protective of Batul, and jealous of the other camels. Layla was Adbar's sister and Abu Jahl's aunt and mother of Batul. She was happy being led by Kaswa, but resented it when Adbar and Abu Jahl got too much attention from him. Benazir was calm, quiet, and very intelligent. She had a light brown coat. Benazir was also Abu Jahl's aunt. She had a shy temperament. Just like the other camels, she could recognize Kadir's voice anywhere and was happy being led by Kaswa. This novel is an artistic attempt to talk about Australia's past. As an immigrant of South Asian origin and someone who lost a parent in difficult circumstances, I believe in the healing power of reading and writing fiction. Historical fiction can be more accessible to a general readership than much professional historical writing. And as historian Ian Britton has observed in a conversation we had recently, it serves to penetrate the parts that conscientious history books tethered to their documents cannot reach. But fiction writers themselves have to be wary of piling on too much background detail in the interests of color and authenticity. For years, I had immersed myself in classic cultural histories and ethnographic studies of Central Australia. Works by Baldwin Spencer and T.G.H. Strello, for example, and studied the life and works of explorers and missionaries, as well as anthropologists. I also started to search the documents on camels, read articles, looked through archives as I helped digitize the Strello archive, and in the process, I decided I would find out as much as I could about the Afghan camel drivers who operated in outback Australia from the 1860s to the 1930s. Cameliers, I learned, were transported to and from Australia every 3 years to explore and later service the continent's inland pastoral industry by lugging freight using camel trains. They were referred to as Afghans, even though they were from various parts of British India and the world, Egypt and Turkey, as well as India and present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. Camel drivers set up stations and outposts known as caravanserai throughout inland Australia, connecting the coast and the bush until the 1930s, when they were basically substituted by trains, automobiles, and roadhouses. Camels and their handlers were indispensable to the exploration and settlement of the desert country, where the environment was too severe for horses. Knowing such things is necessary for writing about the subject if you don't want to commit anachronisms that sap plausibility. But after a time, there's a dryness to such research and a limit on how far it can take you as an artist. I duly read Wikipedia articles and historical documents, but I didn't want to ground my story in them. Aiming at a pure piece of fiction, I have wanted the reader to know only what I let them know through what my characters, and particularly my protagonist, Kadir, think, see, feel, experience, and preeminently feel. I want to get to the base of feeling, and this was something I could not get from simply looking at archives, old photos, and talking to other people. As a writer, I'm interested in the inner selves of people and of other animals. I seek to go beyond the external details of setting and context and historical time, which is why this novel is closely connected to dream states and poetry. This year marks the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. The Italian poet knew how to convey the feeling of exile. The plot of the Divine Comedy is this: a man undertakes a journey which leads him to visit hell, purgatory, and paradise. His guides are Virgil and Beatrice. In my novel, my cameleer and his camels walk with 5 scientists and 2 Aboriginal guides named Top Hat and Donkey, and they encounter a variety of characters along the way. They visit or inhabit earthly equivalents of hell, purgatory, and paradise. I have written and rewritten my novel several times to make my characters and story come alive in English, knowing that my characters would not speak the English that I know. But this is a novel. The past is another country or a complex of countries and cultures. I'm interested in crossing cultures with sensitivity. There's a risk of appropriation or projection, and with those camels, a corny anthropomorphism. But without taking and managing such risks, we'd risk killing off the very possibility of fiction and the chance it offers to give an empathetic voice to creatures, human and animal, that for various reasons have not had one. I don't want to keep writing novels from the point of view of an Indian. That is why I have chosen to use an Afghan cameleer as my main protagonist. Though I inevitably draw on my family heritage as well as my Australian experiences. My having lived in Kolkata and also Melbourne and Alice Springs pervades everything I write. The more time I spend on it, however, I have freed myself from my own memories and research, and my novel departs from personal and social histories and moves towards a form of emotional exploration that combines my identity and embraces Australia's complex heritage. I had to leave historical records and family memories aside and go to a deeper, more empathetic place. This was and remains a mysterious place. I want to limit my own vocabulary, introduce different argots, make the work poetic through the use of language, metaphor, onomatopoeia, rather than documentary or realistic. For example, my protagonist, Kadir, has a special healing power. He is a Hakim, so I had to learn something about the Hakim's expertise and techniques of traditional healing, yes? But in the novel, my main concern was to invoke the patois of the Hakim and create a unique or hitherto unexplored argot for Australian literature. I did this in order to get to his feelings on being placed in a quarantine camp as soon as he arrives in Australia, as well as to the feelings of those who have to confront this stranger in their midst. This work, like much of my previous writing, is about exile, border psychology, land, loss, masculinity, male friendships, violence, and healing. But having written a play relating to such themes, The First Garden, a novel set in the recent past, The Burning Elephant, and a memoir, Into the Suburbs, I'm now experimenting with a new mode. I'm interested in the tradition of war novels, the things they carried, All Quiet on the Western Front, Fly Away Peter, A Long Journey into the Night, The Lost Thoughts of Dead Soldiers, The Man Without Qualities, Voss, The Iliad, right up to David Diop's At Night, All Blood is Black, which won this year's International Man Booker Award. I'm interested in child soldiers, perceptions of war and suffering, various depictions of war. These works consider what makes us human and inhumane, the sacred and the profane. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, received a Burma medal. My uncle Sushil traveled from Mumbai and worked in Afghanistan, providing medical supplies. My cousin Keith left his home in Chennai and spent time in Afghanistan driving trucks and later took his life. I am lucky. I have not been to war, but I have witnessed sectarian violence and am acquainted with violence in the Australian outback. This kind of violence I have seen, the kind of violence I have seen though was horrific, and I try and purge this in my writing. In India, my family saw Sikhs burn after the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated in 1984. I wrote about this in my YA novel, The Burning Elephant. In my teenage years, I was beaten by gangs in suburban Melbourne. My father's body was found floating in Brighton Bay. I'm not a Hakim or a Camelier, but my protagonist is, and so I have had to learn a lot along the way. Patrick White's Boss dominates the Australian literary landscape. To me, it is the great Australian novel, and I often thought about rewriting this book from the perspective of the Cameliers. I think my present novel is a contribution to the conversation that Patrick White started in Voss. Here, the man with the vision is the man with the camels, the man who will be expended the moment he isn't useful. And his vision is humble and flawed rather than arrogant and flawed. But what if we went further and also saw Australian history through the camel's eye? Only the Animals by Ceridwen Dovey, Melville's Moby Dick, and Jack London's White Fang present the world through the perspective of various animals. Virginia Woolf wrote a biographical novel about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's household through the eyes of a dog called Flush. Dumb Witness, where a dog is the only observer of a murder, allowed Agatha Christie to indulge in her love of dogs. Perhaps only animals can tell us what it is to be human. So when considering titles for my book, I've been tossing up between The Camelier and Echoing. Nabokov's Speak Memory, Speak Camel. I haven't settled on a name yet. Camels are migrants to this country. They are well suited to the Australian continent and have adapted and settled in all too successfully. These creatures were introduced to Australia around 1840, and they continue to run wild and breed in Western Australia, the Northern Territory, South Australia, and Queensland. There are now more than 1 million feral camels in Australia, and we have no clear plan about how to tackle this situation. These even-toed ungulates have spread into farmland and desert communities, are overwhelmed by them. Samia Kutun's Australianama, the South Asian Odyssey in Australia, 2018, considers the interconnecting history of the South Asian and Aboriginal Australian worlds in the British Empire. This book very elegantly shows how different nationalities and ethnicities were grouped together in the Australian imagination as Afghan. For example, across the book's chapters, Khatun tracks a book of Bengali poetry in Broken Hill that was thought to be a Quran. Khatun asked two important questions with her work. Firstly, who was the unnamed traveller who brought Bengali stories of the prophets to Broken Hill? Secondly, can historical storytelling in English do more than simply induct readers into white subjectivities? Such questions have been forming in my consciousness, and I'd been prompted to start researching them before the publication of Australianama or the subsequent release of Roderick Mackay's movie about a fictional cameleer in Western Australia, Furnace, 2020. I owned a house on Muhammad Street in Alice Springs for many years. And before that, on first moving to the Northern Territory in 2004, I'd occupied a unit in the suburb of Sadadin, named after a cameleer. Emigrating from Kolkata to Melbourne when I was a boy of 11, I have felt deeply connected to and passionately curious about both India and Australia from early on. And in adulthood, I have used my artistic perspective, an outsider's perspective, an immigrant's sensibility, someone who has lived and worked with First Nations people for 15 years in the centre of Australia, to tell stories that deal with each country's national psyche. The trailblazing achievements of land rights activist, anthropologist, and botanist Olive Pink, whom I found out about when I went to Alice Springs, provided my first subject for an Australian story. And the tumultuous times of the storming of the Golden Temple and Indira Gandhi's death, which coincided with my departure from my birthplace, was my first Indian subject. More recently, I've written a memoir, Into the Suburbs, that recounts my adolescence and my challenging adjustment to a new life in the Australian suburbs. Going on to live in the middle of the oldest continent on Earth, living alongside First Nations people, I became interested in deep time and came to realize that much of the history of what we now call Australia, both before and after white settlement, is largely unwritten, misunderstood, and swept under the carpet. Have we been emphasizing the wrong history? By and large, it was because of the Indian, Pakistani, and Afghan cameleers and their camels that the centre of Australia came to be settled by outsiders. There's a long prehistory to this, extending far beyond Australia. The camel has been domesticated and used as a pack animal for travelling and transporting goods for more than 3,000 years. These animals are capable of carrying heavy loads and walking long distances. They have the ability to lose almost half of their body weight without serious consequences. The hump on a camel's back stores fatty tissue, which the camel's body has access to as a nourishing source of sustenance when food and water are inadequate. When water is available to them again, though, they have the amazing ability to drink many liters in minutes. Camels have a special place in most of the world's great religions. Yet in the desert, I would often see camels shot and their carcasses left to rot. On the other hand, there was the annual Camel Cup that I attended each year in Alice Springs. I became interested in camels when I lived on Muhammad Street in the Gap in Alice Springs. The house was built on top of the Indian, Pakistani, and Afghan cameliers marketplace. My children were born and raised there. And we had a vegetable garden filled, and we had a vegetable garden. Sorry. I'll be right.
Do you want to take a minute, Chris?
Yeah, just I'm good. It's just sorry. I'll keep going. Yeah, let me have some water. The reader, you listeners probably need a minute too. I've been talking to. Sorry. Vegetable garden filled with camel. Vegetable garden. So my children were born there and raised there, and we had a vegetable garden filled with camel manure from my mate Marcus's camel farm in Ilkapa. Another friend, Neil, would wrestle, capture, and slaughter wild camels and take their meat to the butcher for pet food. He found this very tough emotionally. When I tell my Indian family all this, they are invariably amused. Camels? Muhammad Street? In Alice Springs? Who would have thought? As far back as I can recall, Afghans have lived in the Indian city of Kolkata, my birthplace. My Afghan aunt, Laila, would knit my cousins and I cardigans when we lived there and tell us stories of her birth, of her country of birth. 30 kilometers southeast of Melbourne city centre is my other home, Dandenong, part of the Kulin Nations. With its own little India and Afghan bazaar precincts. In Melbourne and Alice Springs, I taught a vibrant and diverse range of students, high school students, primary school students, including the descendants of cameliers. After writing my play about Olive Pink and being invited to work at the Museum of Central Australia, I had what can only be described as a spiritual awakening. And I began to have dreams of an Afghan man with big hands. These dreams or hallucinations, my research on the cameliers in Australia and South Asian history. These dreams, or hallucinations, my research on the cameliers in Australian and South Asian history and the time I've spent directly observing camels have all led me to my present project. More recently, I have been reflecting on ethnic and other kinds of diversity. I couldn't help noticing how my parents had hit a glass ceiling in their careers in Australia. At university, in the early 90s, recently was this man's birthday, by the way, I discovered Edward Said's Orientalism and did my honours thesis on perceptions of India with special reference to E.M. Forster and Niraj Chowdhury. Said's work was a revelation. I once heard him speak at Melbourne Town Hall and I marvelled at his gold Rolex, but I'm digressing. But Said's work was a revelation. I could see how his ideas about othering applied in popular culture and in high culture, not just in the Middle East, but also in the way we viewed India and Australia. While at university, I lost my father, who had become frustrated and depressed since coming to Australia, and I have written about this in my memoir. I began reading novels and kept a journal to deal with my grief. I read Kipling's Kim and Forster's A Passage to India. And after Said, I also read Indian authors like Niraj Chowdhury, Amit Chowdhury, Vikram Seth, Hanif Qureshi, and V.S. Naipaul. Niraj Chowdhury was particularly important to me. He wrote Autobiography of an Unknown Indian and A Passage to England, which was what prompted me to compare him to Forster in my thesis. I also love the other Indian authors I mentioned, and the range of their work and the diversity of their voices appealed to me a lot. I thought I should write in a variety of styles and modes as well as subjects. Geography matters. Where you write as well as the places you choose to write about. And so does history. The times in which you're writing, as well as the times you might be writing about. Yet literature as an art form, the literature that will endure cannot be constrained within those finite limits. And ultimately does not have a nationality or a time frame. So I often argue and try and convince myself that I don't take labels too seriously and have fun playing with place and time as well as with a variety of voices, styles, and genres. Diversity is not just about species and race. It must also embrace ideas and values and how we shape, form, and articulate them. These things need to be diverse and continually contested or debated, rather than just affirmed or dismissed according to some prescribed community standard of a particular time. That's what I hope to provoke in and through my new book. Finally, I'm very grateful to the University of Technology, Sydney, the staff, the students, and the Copyright Agency for this residency. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm hoping I'm coming on to speak of you. It's a bit strange. I was just seeing a camel there for a second. So, Chris, I was thinking while you were speaking that apart from the fact that obviously everyone's going to be, so interested in reading this novel because, there's such a, I can see even from the comments that are coming through that there's an excitement about what you're writing about. And, I think there's kind of freshness there. And I'd like to, I know it's hard to talk about these things when you are halfway through a piece of work. I know how difficult that is, but I'm hoping we can kind of unpick that a little bit in about the 20 minutes or so that we have to talk now. But I was thinking when I first saw your topic, which delighted me because of the, especially the reference to Nabokov, also that that, you know, it's that old saying that a camel's a horse designed by a committee. And, you know, it's somewhat like working with COVID as well. I think that everything's slightly strangely and kind of brilliantly shaped. And, you know, and as you found tonight, time and emotions kind of take us by surprise in this moment as well. And, you know, someone who, you know, had a little weep on Triple R the other night, talking about my book, it's just, we're in this time that is so, you know, strangely shaped. But I wanted to start by talking to you about the word purity, Chris. It's such an unusual word in a literary context, and I think that's what, you know, one of the things that's really instantly interesting about your title and your paper. But you know, we've got a literary context where so much writing is trending towards mixing genres and forms. There's also a word with a, you know, a slightly tainted sort of past in terms of being wedded to abstract concepts like, you know, nationalism. And so we tend to sort of handle it with kid gloves, if at all. But I think you're talking about purity in a sort of slightly different way, not as something about formal conventions, but, you know, as a way of, as a mode of writing that allows you to write back against some of those, you know, some of those concepts, I guess, that it's been kind of associated with. So I just wanted to just explore a tiny bit more that idea for you of what, you know, the pure fiction approach has been for you, because it's something that, you know, you seem to, you know, you've found the wind under your wings, you know, I think, in this time that you said to me that you know, you've, and it was this idea of purity that's kind of carried you into that material. So I just wanted to talk about what that word allows you to do, and, you know, and what, you know, why it was the sort of jumping off point for this paper and book.
What a wonderful preamble to that question, Delia, and that's why your students are so lucky. What a word to choose as well. I mean, for the listeners and the participants, I mean, purity. I mean, if we think about the word purity and nationalism and literary form and what it means to write a story or to tell your own story, in current discussions in terms of, you know, who's an Australian, who are the Cameliers, who are the real Australians, who's the real Indian, who's the real Afghan, who's this, who's that. I mean, this word purity just keeps, it transcends all of that. And you know what? It even encroaches onto the camels, because, you know, I often hear that we in Australia have the most pure camels because, you know, they remain roaming wild in the desert. So yes, so I wanted to play with all of that, and also acknowledge that none of us are pure. I mean, certainly I'm not, and I'm mischievous writing this story, and my story is not going to fit very well. My memoir didn't fit very well in any category, and my whole career doesn't. I mean, as Andrew Pipos once asked me, how does your work link together? And I'm like, well, a bit like me, nothing quite fits. and I think that's been my journey. And I sort of use my work as a means of just dealing with how nothing quite fits. I wish there was a pure way of doing things. Or I mean, you know, I think you know, I mean, even history, I mean, you know, I went to university in the 90s and everything got very confused in terms of postmodernism and stuff. So, I mean, you know, I've been fascinated by what's pure and what we can put our finger on and what is truth. For many, many years, I've wrestled with this. And so I've tried to do it in different slabs in my career. So trying to, you know, articulate what it was like to be a child in Calcutta, or what it was like to start a botanical garden in Alice Springs, and then what it was like to come to Australia, and also just memory. So and then this concept of dream states as we're entering into a new project. And so yes, what a question. And I think in a way you answered the question for me in your preamble, which was, but but it's so great that you could highlight that for me as well.
Well, Chris, you know, there's something about that story in particular that I think just plays off that those concepts that we have of purity in Australia. Even the you know, that Peter Drew, who's been putting up those posters, Aussie, and he had the man identified as Afghan as one of his most popular posts. I don't know if they were up, you know, where you were, but in Sydney,
oh no,
plastered everywhere with the
I know.
yeah, but you know, that guy Monga Khan was identified as Afghan, but he was actually Indian from the village of Batrahan. I think that's
From Haryana.
Yeah, thank you. And he was, you know, and there's something about that kind of just seemed to fit into the fact that history. You know, when I've only been to Alice Springs very briefly, but there's something about that Afghan story in Central Australia that it seems sort of mysteriously absent in the national story of Australia. And yet at the same time, when you're there, as you say, the names of the streets, that I think the oldest mosque in Australia is an Afghan mosque in Adelaide. You know, you drive into Palm Valley and there are the date palms that were the terraforming of the earth there by those Afghan cameliers as well. And, you know, I'm just kind of curious about why we haven't, it's such a fascinating story. And I was wondering if you think there are kind of elements that, you know, we could tease that out a little bit more, that you know, mean that it hasn't been, you know, spoken about, put in the history, and also not, you know, not really in our writing.
It comes up from time to time. I mean, the Afghan cameliers come up from time to time. I mean, I'm not stating anything new here. I'm not going for, I'm discovering something new or groundbreaking at all. I mean, there's a long tradition of it, including the train, the GAN train, for instance, that you can catch from Adelaide up to stops in Alice and then goes on to Darwin. There have been many documentaries and movies and classic Australian literature that have dealt with this topic, and yes, and Peter Drew's posters, of course. I'm quite peripatetic, so I did see Peter Drew's posters all the way in Darwin to Victoria and around the place. So what I was thinking though in terms of this project was, whilst I saw those posters, and whilst, you know, even the other day, a few months ago, I think it was, Meredith Lake did a thing on Afghans on Compass. But whilst you know, if once you're interested, you'll see them everywhere, including if you go to Alice Springs. I mean, I have the date plants around my house too, and then there's the date farm. And now that, you know, once you've got it in your consciousness, it's going to be everywhere, and you'll see it everywhere and be like, oh, it's so obvious. But until you do have it, I mean, you know, things like, I mean, it was even like this for me in my experience. I mean, when I first heard people describe Satadine, where I first lived, and the way, in the Australian accent, oh, where are we going? Oh, let's go to Satadine. Let's go to Satadine. And so I just thought Satadine was maybe an Aboriginal word, or maybe maybe it was like a Alice Springs word, you know, for a suburb. And then all of a sudden, I realized that what everyone was saying was Sadadine. And once I heard that, I was like, oh, of course. It was just, and so then you start to see, oh, there's this, it's all there. It's all there. And it's just a matter. But then I thought, you know, another thing that when I did see Peter Drew's posters, and when I did hear the podcast, what I thought, and this is the beauty of fiction, is I wanted to get in the head of one of those men. I wasn't just happy seeing the photo. I mean, being a writer, I wanted to get inside the head. Hence, speak head. Speak head. Like, you know, whether it's a whale or a camel. I mean, as writers, we want to get inside the head and inhabit it. We're greedy. And And yes, and eat the date, not just look at the date. So I've got friends, you know, who can pollinate the date and literally eat the date and sell the date, you know. So cover all bases. And so as writers, we live vicariously. We want to be part of that. And so I wanted to get beyond just that dimension and get right into it.
There's that problem though with writing historical fiction, though. I think that it's as you said in your paper, it's such a hard, you know, it's not just turning the lights on in the past and, you know, and showing how things sort of were, or, you know, perhaps seem to be, you know, look at how they were with sort of present knowledge. There's always that kind of really tricky set of negotiations around that, you know, and, you know, some people legislate the detail, and, you know, then we have this history in Australia of becoming really obsessive about detail and, you know, sort of almost like a kind of an alienation effect, that people were like super historical beings who were aware of the Tar Macadam or whatever that was around them. You know, and there's that moment in E.L. Doctorow's Waterworks where one of the characters, McIlvaine, one of my favourite novels, turns around to the reader and says, you know, I couldn't quite find the quote, but you may think you are living in modern times here and now, but let me tell you, there was nothing quaint about us, there was nothing historical about us. So I'm wondering, as you've been, you know, if the camels are kind of helpful in this, but, you know, there's that question of, you know, how to write a historical novel now, and how to tackle that question of the distance, of the historical distance, of history itself. You know, do we look at it as history, or do we just kind of plunge in? How have you, and a lot of this is kind of gut and instinctive, I know that you kind of have to work out with every historical novel, but how have you sort of tackled that question of how to, you know, write into that history beyond kind of wanting to make these characters as alive and you know, intimately knowable as possible?
Great question.
It's the one that I find so really hard. So I'm hoping you can, you know, give me some wisdom about it, or some thoughts about it.
Well, considering I love your historical novels, okay, I'll give you some wisdom, Delia. Thank you. Okay. My process. The part of this has had a process. So I spent years researching this stuff. I mean, years, right? I don't know. You could go back to 2004, or you could say, you know, but earnestly, probably around 2014, I got writing, 2013, and actually started to write notes and stuff before it was just floating in the head. Started 2014, so a long time. And then, you know, and picked up a few things along the way. But this year, when, you know, getting this fellowship and, you know, feeling so great about that, for the first 6 months, I was resting on my laurels, thinking, I've got this history, I've got it all down, you know, and I've got this fellowship. I'm fine. But about halfway through the fellowship, I had a rude awakening. And I realized that the manuscript was relying too much on research and too much on my brain, thinking my brain was the boss. And it was thinking, oh, I'll use the research like this, and I'll get the characters to say this, and I'll use this metaphor, this scene to speak to today. And I was just trying to be so clever to myself. And basically the manuscript went downhill very quickly. So I had a massive panic attack about halfway through this year. And I reached out to a couple of really strong reader friends that I have, who were kind enough to read my manuscript and, you know, and also bold enough to tell me, hey, you know, this is crap and this is good. And, you know, and I'm like, I needed that. And I trusted those readers. And so that was great. And so then I had to come back to the manuscript and rewrite the whole thing. So one of the latest lockdowns, I enlisted a couple of friends to basically hound me nearly every day. I'd had Zoom meetings with a couple of people. They may be watching, you know who you are. And it was intense. And I mean, it was intense as in, you know, they'd give me this is not good. And then I'd go away and just write for, you know, until my back broke and stuff. But I would try and throw away the research, get rid of the research, forget about being clever, just actually think of story, pretend no one will ever read it, forget about any critics or anything like that, and just write a story. And that's what I tried to do. And that's how I tried to address what you were asking, which was, you know, how do we make, you know, about juggling history and juggling, you know, not wanting to sound like history, but also make people alive. And so what I did was okay, what will a character feel like? Or put simply, what would a camel feel like if they were being prodded and probed and prodded in a certain situation? And I would just try and imagine that. And hence the start, when I read a bit of the italicized, I mean, I said italicized, but in my notes it's italicized. It were just notes that I kept in terms of what the different characters might be like and how their personalities then would then impact on what they experienced. And so, yes, I had a go at some of that. And I think, and on also the different characters. So I thought of it like that. And yeah.
I guess the other thing is that you, and maybe it's one of the reasons it's also been a slightly difficult story to tell in our national history, is that, you know, you can't write the story of the Afghan Cameleers without the history of Indigenous people in Australia. You know, and of course a small but significant number of Indigenous Australians are Muslim, you know, from that time, going back to the ubiquity of the Cameleers in Central Australia. And children with Afghan and Indigenous parentage were very likely to be sent to the missions. So there's that cultural anxiety again about purities of raising its head again. And I believe some children of Indigenous and Afghan heritage were sent to India as well to avoid the mission system. So we've got this story that just kind of, you know, we've got this Central Australia here, but this story that kind of, you know, extends so far beyond it, and two ways births of Indigenous history sort of, you know, going offshore here from here as well. But such a vexed question to write about Indigenous stories, but you know, they're so entwined. So I'm just wondering how you've approached that issue in your writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With deep sensitivity and humility, really. So I've asked my agent and the publisher that I work with, you know, to consider my work with that in mind. I mean, I've worked with Aboriginal people in various roles for many years, and in many projects, ranging from the museum, highly sensitive things, and highly to you know, very to not so sensitive things like, you know, teaching in primary schools and secondary schools and stuff. So I've had a lot of experience, and probably more than most in Australia, I would say. I mean, this is not me speaking out of turn. It's just how my life ended up. I've gotten jobs without asking for them. I mean, you know, when I got to digitize most of the Open Strello archive, I didn't ask for that job. You know, some people asked me to do that job. So some jobs have been, you know, things I haven't. And what I try to do is remain true to my vocation. And my vocation is a writer. Everyone knows that. If they come up to me, they know they might be right. I will let you know if you are going to be written about. You know, I'm a writer. That's my job. Sometimes people come up to me and ask me, hey, what are you, still writing? Hey, Chris, how you going? Still writing? That answer is, there is no answer. It's like, of course, that's all I do. I'm always writing. I am a writer. I decided very early on at 18 years old that that's what I was going to do. And so I just keep writing. And I tried and write, I mean, Franzen said, truth, beauty, right? Didn't he say something like that? Truth and beauty? I think that's a good, I think that's the litmus test. I mean, is it true? Because if it's true, should you, you know, the greatest gift you can give anyone is truth. Sometimes people might not want to hear it. And well, they can choose not to, but is it true? And as an artist, is it beautiful? Now that's subjective as well. So is it true and is it beautiful? And if you don't want to know the truth, that's fine. You can live in ignorance and you can go on to live in ignorance for the rest of your life. But me as a writer and as a person, I'm interested in truth. And sometimes I lie to myself. So if I'm lying to myself, I'm happy for people to correct me.
It seems to me like we are, writing is heading in the way of trying to acknowledge more complex stories. And that's frightening as a writer. And it's, you know, but it's kind of necessary. And I'm thinking again of, you know, so many writers are now starting to think about writing the non-human realm, which of course, you know, as I say, you know, the entwinement again in, you know, between the camels and, you know, their poos and the seeds and the, you know, and the plants that have been grown in the valleys, and, you know, there's such an entwinement in that history there of these animals that have now gone feral as well. But I'm thinking about, do you feel, I'm going to open things up to questions now, but do you feel like you are now starting to speak Camel? You know, what does that, you know, how have you, sort of that language, what has happened to your language in your writing in terms of that speaking Camel? Is speaking Camel being, looking at entwined histories of being more, you know, sort of speaking all sorts of hybrid, you know, all sorts of hybrid, complex onshore, offshore, entwined sort of world histories. Is that speaking Camel?
Well, the first thing when you said that, I was thinking of, you know, the younger people that I deal with as a teacher or as a parent. And when you said, oh, what does it mean to speak Camel? That's such a great question. And so I'm going to go with this. Yes. So, you know, I inhabit the Camel to the point, not just where I speak it, but I can inhabit it even in my physical characteristics. So, you know, I can do a camel impersonation. Literally, I become a camel. So I imagine the camel literally eating, you know? And I imagine its mouth, and I imagine its eyelashes, and I imagine its regal face. And just going like that, and you know, and so yes, completely inhabiting these characters, and it's inhabiting the animal, inhabiting. So actually forgetting about myself. I mean, if I wanted to, I mean, I know, you know, this is a bit of a crossover between the last question and this question, and I am very conscious as a student of literature, but also now stepping into the academy and stuff, is the concept of own stories. Now, I'm not a camel, you know, and so, but I did write my own story, and I called it a memoir, because there was a part of me that didn't want to acknowledge that. I wanted to write that memoir as a novel, and there were novelistic aspects to it. But I had to come out and say, look, there's a lot of truth in this. And, you know, I could call it autofiction. I didn't do that. Writing is about courage. And sometimes you've got to say, well, I'm going to call, you know, I'm going to call this a memoir. And I'm going to call this a novel. I'm going to call that a play. And I think those categories, I mean, you can only play within the rules you've got. And you can't change the rules halfway through the game. And this game of novel writing has been going since Don Quixote and possibly earlier to the Ramayana. various texts have, used animals and humans, and we come from a long tradition of writers and an oral tradition. So just trying to fit into the tradition and to keep this great tradition, to be part of it. I mean, I've been nurtured by it, as I mentioned in the talk. When life seemed overwhelming and difficult, my great comfort has been writers and reading and literature. I remember coming to your talks, Delia, and listening, and the other teachers, and just thinking, wow, how lucky these students are to hear this stuff from other practicing writers, because I didn't get that opportunity to go to do a creative writing course. And, for me, this year has been like a student. I've gone back and participated in so much. And it's been such a joy, because I love books. I love reading. And I love it to the point where it teaches me so much. It nourishes me. It helps me. It helped me grieve. It helps me grieve. And I do believe, and I know this is a very a difficult statement, and I do believe in the healing function of literature. That's no joke.
Well, look, it's been fantastic to have you as well, Chris. And, I think we're all I'm getting a lot of, everyone's, saying we want to, everyone's sort of very fascinated by this idea of speaking Camel. So everyone's imagination's going in the chat function, which I'm just looking at as well. And, if anyone has any questions for the next 10 minutes, please, please throw them at us. Someone has said, great talk, Chris. When can we expect to see your book on a shelf at the local bookstore? The question every writer wants to hear.
Look, I don't think, I mean, my boss is always my editor, my publisher, and my agent. So I'm not in a rush, as much as I'm working fast, and there's a part of me that wants it to be there today. There's a part of me that wants it to be there last year. As writers, we want everything out. But look, I'm serious about sensitivity, so I have to wait to sensitivity readers. I have to wait to my publishers appreciate my work. I expect it to have a standard. I mean, many writers aren't willing to talk as openly about a project like this, because, it may or may not ever happen. But, something I'm about open. I mean, I'm not leaving people in cliffhangers. That's not me. I'm not a crime fiction writer who's going to keep you in I mean, I might write a crime fiction one day, but my project is a slightly different project. My writing project is a slightly different project. And in terms of when things come out, so I try and be open in terms of process. And there was something else that prompted me in that, but I've lost the train of thought.
All right, it's always that question of sort of time, and as we know in creative writing, one of my students, their novel from 10 years ago has, that they've been working on for 10 years has come out. It takes novels. Fiction is slow. They take the time that they take. It's been lovely to be able to give you time to kind of to see you rejig. It's always so exciting to actually have a writer working in place for us to see, to see that. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions before we wind things down. I did see one before where someone was saying, how did you, what brought you to Central Australia, Chris? That sort of, this opening up of this great, literary territory for you. What was it's been so fertile, what brought you there is the question.
Yeah, so I was a youngish man in 2004, and went to live in Alice Springs, partly because, I was actually offered a job there as a high school teacher. I had taught for 3 years in Victoria. I guest edited Meanjin in 2004. And on that evening, I had a choice of going, I was offered 2 jobs, one in the UK and one in Alice Springs. So it was like 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I chose the red one.
Okay. sorry, I've just seen 2 more questions in a different box to the chat box. Patrick Allington asks, could you ask Chris what, if anything, writing his memoir has taught him about writing fiction?
Patrick, thanks, Patrick. Well, as Patrick, you would know, when you're writing a book, the next one is equally hard. It's all hard, it's all difficult, and we're always beginners. So, so not much. Just a beginner, just after writing. It was just like, okay, but I needed to get that memoir out and out of my system. And so it was a weight lifted off me. So it didn't necessarily, so I'm writing with a less weight, I think, on my shoulders. You know, Into the Suburbs was a big weighty book, but I had this other weight in terms of this Camel story, a different sort of weight in terms of the Australian history. That's why the Suburbs was a personal weight, and then the Camel is like the national weight, if that makes sense. And so, you know, they were both on these shoulders, and the deeper I went into the continent, the second weight, the national weight, began to weigh on me. And as a writer, I thought, okay, what do I do with this weight? And I didn't want to jump in and write about it until I felt I had a duty to readers and to my friends to expose where I was coming from. I didn't have to do that. But I thought, okay, if I'm going to make my writing open, if I'm going to open myself up like this with this writing stuff, I'm going to be a bit transparent and show, not just the work will not just show, but then I thought, okay, you know, so yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, actually. I'm trying to answer that because it was Patrick, and I'm trying to answer it as I would Patrick, but yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know.
It's always hard. It always sort of takes you by surprise, doesn't it? Because sometimes once you're in the slipstream, you don't necessarily feel like there's that much. Because there's a thin membrane, you know, between one and the other as well. One more question that I can see here before we wind things up, and that is from Ben Lee. Really fascinating novel, Chris. Can't wait to see how it ends up. Okay. You said you had to write and rewrite the novel several times. What was it that you needed to discover or to, and I like this one, to discard in those early versions to get to where you are now?
Sometimes there was the thing which jumped in my head then, Ben, was the woodenness in some of the characters. For example, when you're doing historical stuff, the white characters, so I've got scientists and all sorts of people in my repertoire. You know, especially historical fiction, I mean, it can seem a bit starched and, oh, hello, old chap sort of stuff. And whilst that might be good, it's also clunky and so how do I get rid of that clunk? I'm still not sure what's going to fit in and what's going to, you know, when I do get feedback from publisher, editor, and all this stuff, like, you know, I don't know what I will be discarding, but it's been constant discarding and still waiting on some feedback. But along the way, some of the great readers that I mentioned earlier, Ben, that I got, have really helped me bring out, say, for example, the camels. You know, bring out the camels. Some have helped me, you know, and then occasionally it's also not listening to readers too. So occasionally going, because some have told me, I can't give too many specific examples, but you know, so it's intuition. You have to be intuitive, but you've also got to be listening too. So it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing because ultimately you don't really know what people will like, but actually doesn't ring true to me, I suppose, is what I'm after. Truth and beauty.
It's so hard. I mean, you know, it's just, you don't sort of know until you've kind of come out the other side sometimes, you know.
Even then, I mean, I'm still learning stuff about the burning elephant now, and I would love to rewrite the burning elephant right now. I'm still working on it, you know. I reckon I'm I want the Burning Orphan to be reworked. I want Into the Suburbs to be, you know, like I could just keep going back. In fact, I remember there was a painter who went to the Sydney Opera House, Ben, and he would look at his artwork at the Sydney Opera House, and someone told me that he would actually occasionally take to it. But you didn't hear that from me.
All right. Well, look, I think we will. We might close there because it's been such. I'm looking at my chat box, Chris. I'm looking slightly distracted with lots of people saying, "Fabulous, thank you, so interesting." And I think you can see there's going to be a, not that I want that to be inhibiting, because it's sometimes hard to think about an audience, but that there will be a really interested audience for this book. And I would like to just say thank you very much for being our fabulous writer in residence and our virtual one coming in from Melbourne. But that's kind of talking about sort of stories that kind of move across boundaries. It's been a really exciting thing for us, and we're very happy to have had the copyright agency funding for 3 years of these positions. So I just wanted to thank our sponsors for this particular very dynamic program that we're very lucky. We're very, very lucky to have. We're so lucky to have you working on this book with us, Chris. So I would like to thank you from all of us on staff as well for your and from the students for very generous presence here as well.
Yes, I would really like to thank you, Delia, and the staff at UTS. Even though we haven't caught up, and the media staff and all the staff. I mean, I've just been just blown away by all of you, and just your dedication for your students and your care. I've really seen it firsthand, and it's incredible. I've learned so much from all of you, and your work too. I mean, at the same time, actually, I love all your work and your writing, and as fellow writers and editors, there's so much that and just the camaraderie, and I just love that. The students have taught me so much by sharing their work with me. I'm thinking of, I think of their work so vivid and so polished, and to have the honor to read master's students, and wow. And, I haven't done a master's, and so I'm reading master's students, and I'm like, wow, your work is so great. And I wish I could be more critical. Okay, I'll try. And, and I of course want to thank UTS, the university, and the Cal Copyright Agency Limited for the money and the time and the prestige, because this is a very prestigious thing, and it hasn't been lost on me. And for the person that come after me, what a great opportunity. I'm sad to go, but I'm really excited for whoever's coming next, and for the students to experience these, whether it was Bree Lee and the people before, and then the ones coming after. What a great initiative. And I bet there are lots of writers just keen to jump in next year. So I recommend it. It's awesome.
Well, this is where we would, this is where we would all take you out for a drink, Chris. So this is one of the sad things of COVID. But one of these days, you will come and come through the department in process. But thank you so much for your presence, Laura's presence this year, and for tonight. We will say farewell to everyone. Thank you for the people behind the scenes, Serena, as well, for helping us with the tech tonight. We will look forward to hearing more of this, more of you, and more of this novel. And your speech will be coming out, I should mention, in Sydney Review of Books as well. So if anyone would like to revisit it, it should be coming out hopefully this week. So So thank you, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye.